Kia ora tātou, welcome to this Fabian session. Our panel will be discussing the job ahead for the progressive parties, for Labour, for Greens and for Te Pāti Māori. How can these three parties win back power? The format, each panel member has a chance to lay out some ideas and then the others will join in conversations with them, so they'll each go in turn. Our panel tonight is Simon Wilson, the senior writer from the New Zealand Herald, Bridie Witton, press gallery reporter for Stuff, who's just been at the airport waiting for Winston. It's a bit like waiting for Cotto, I think, and probably is illuminating. And Ollie Neas, who's a freelancer who's published variously in The Guardian, The Listener, North and South, and Spinoff. And apologies tonight from our fourth panel member, Danyl McLauchlan. He tested positive for COVID this morning. Let's start with you, Ollie. You wrote in the Spinoff about the Greens Labour problem. Tell us a bit more about that.
Sure, thank you, and good evening, everybody. I know you're all here to see Danyl. I think I'd start first by providing a bit more context for I'll come to the piece I wrote, but first perhaps speak a little bit to the broader question that we're here to speak to today. And I think it's important to be clear as to what the question actually is, because that shapes the answer. And I think for me the question isn't so much what do the three parties in Parliament on the left do to get elected in 3 years. For me the question is what does it take, or rather what do we need to do to elect a left government that's capable and willing to implement the kind of agenda that many of us thought the Ardern government was going to be. And so I think framing it in those terms is clarifying. And I think the reason for framing it that way is obvious in a sense, because we have had the Ardern government and we can see that despite its many meaningful victories, that in many respects, I think for many on the left it fell short. And I don't propose to go into those in detail, but perhaps we can speak more about that if needed. And so I think in a way the question actually, without jumping ahead, that Simon, you ask in your piece is a really essential question to start with. It's what went wrong. And I've read your piece and thought you raised some important points. But for me, I think the key question there is ultimately it's a failure of political leadership in a sense, in that there were many obstacles along the way in terms of, Simon and Danyl in their pieces raise issues in terms of obstacles within the public sector. But I think ultimately I see it as a failure of political leadership in the sense of the party being fundamentally averse to political conflict, unwilling to take on vested interests, and unwilling to really make the case to the public for a left agenda. We saw that with the various reform programs, but I think more fundamentally it was in the selection of issues to pursue through reform. And I think the paradigmatic example is the tax issue, right? It was clear there was just an unwillingness to make the case to the public, and unwillingness to get into the kind of fight that would inherently involve. But if we're talking about a transformational agenda, and it's kind of an annoying term of phrase, we're talking about ultimately redistributing wealth and power. That's what we're talking about. There's no way through unless you're willing to get into a fight. So the question is then, I see it as, what does it take to have a left government that is willing to get into a fight like that? And that's the question I think that this piece I wrote for the Spinoff was aimed at. And for me, the starting point was an observation that some people might not share, which is that right now it feels like the bulk of energy amongst the activist left is going towards the political organising through the Green Party. Understandably, it's the exciting shining light for many of the young. It's got all the good policies. It doesn't have a horrendous track record of capitulations and letdowns that many in this room will be familiar with. But for me, that I think I see the critical question for the next 3 years or so being the contest over the political direction of the Labour Party, and and rebuilding the Labour Party. And that is something that isn't going to happen by itself. The Labour Party, like the Green Party, like the National Party, are not just entities in the abstract. They are movements of people. And one response I've had to my article was people saying, well, that's a you problem, that's not a me problem. You being the Labour Party over there. But the problem we're starting with is a Labour Party that is, at the moment, clearly dominated by that isn't a mass party, that is dominated by, I think I put it slightly flippantly in my piece, lobbyists and professional political operatives, but there's some truth in that. And so ultimately, and the reason I make that argument is because I don't think the strategy of achieving transformational change purely through a minoritarian coalition framework can achieve what it says on the tin. I think when it comes to the hard changes, the hard fights, those are only going to be picked up by left government if the dominant party is independently committed to those. The Green Party can win some important concessions, I think, in a coalition framework, but I think when it comes to matters of redistribution, those are not going to happen unless Labour's willing to campaign on them and win a majority on those terms. I think there was an interesting piece in Stuff recently when James Shaw was interviewed about the current coalition negotiations going on. And he made the point that, look, from his experience, if the major party in a coalition says no, there's nothing you can do about it. And right now, I'm just not confident that unless there's political energy from the left inserted into the Labour Party, that the Labour Party is going to reach that lesson on its own. So it's a very long, digressive, partial explanation.
Tēnā koutou katoa. And thank you, Wellington, for putting this on. I've come down from Auckland for this, and it's very exciting to be in a very full room of people who want things to be better. And you don't always get that anywhere. So it's great. One of the things that strikes me, Ollie, in relation to what your introduction there and the framework you're positing is that I don't see the Labour Party, for all that it didn't do all the things we wanted it to do, or progressive people wanted it to do, I don't see it as a moribund organisation that's not capable of change and improvement and becoming more progressive right now. I had a conversation with David Parker after the campaign launch at the Aotea Centre earlier this year, and this was just at the time when his leader had ruled out absolutely a wealth tax. David was furious, obviously, but he was also quite excited. I won't quote exactly what he said because I think that'd probably be inappropriate, but he made it pretty clear to me that he thinks that his party is changing, has changed, that Hipkins hadn't kept up. And I saw that on the campaign trail, going to meeting after meeting, following activists and party meetings and all the rest around. It was really clear to me that candidates and party workers were dismayed that they couldn't advocate for a wealth tax. And that's not true for all of them, of course, but it was true over and over. And I expect that when the Labour Party comes to have that debate now, or over the next year, I think we're going to see a real change from them. It's like maybe they lost the battle, but the war's about to be won on that side. So the underlying thesis that Labour is in trouble because all the good people have gone to the Greens, and I would add Te Pāti Māori, doesn't quite hold water to me, because I think there are and will always be lots of people who have strong ties to Labour, and they're going to keep those strong ties, and they're going to keep fighting, and they're going to keep winning things. And I think the left benefits, especially under MMP, from having a multiplicity of parties that are different from each other, but that can work together. We need them all. We need them all to be strong. So I think the idea that we need to rethink where people ought to channel their energies and channel them away from the Greens and Te Pāti Māori, which have been the spear carriers, I think that is an argument that has an enormous risk that it just undermines the left.
There's a reason I didn't write the article before the election for exactly that reason. I don't want to seem. I am very optimistic about the Labour Party, and if I wasn't, I wouldn't have written the article. I think it's useful to traverse the wavering histories of the large parties in New Zealand. I mean, if you take the case of Labour, for example, in the 1960s, people were calling it moribund in relation to in earlier decades, and under when Anderton was party president, it enjoyed a significant increase in membership revitalisation. Then, of course, the 1980s came along, things changed hugely. So I think, the vitality of political parties obviously changes and will continue to change. And I guess, in a way, my article is intended at young people, particularly young people who might not be committed currently to a particular political party, but who have formed this view that I think is quite common, that is, I think it takes a slightly kind of branding-based, it's probably the wrong word, approach to party affiliation, which says, well, there's Labour, they're centrists, and the Green Party is leftist. So if I believe in left things, therefore, the end of the conversation is to be involved with the Green Party. And I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. And I think, in a way, you're right, Simon, that it's unhelpful to frame this as a Labour versus Greens thing. The key message I'm trying to make is that I think it's an urgent question to apply greater political energy towards revitalising the Labour Party, because it's reassuring to hear David Parker say that he's confident, but the point that the parliamentary party is dominated by lawyers, of which I'm one, although I'm not in the parliament, remains an issue. And I think that the broader conversation about greater representation, not just in terms of gender, sexual orientation, and ethnicity, but also in terms of class background remains important, because I think those factors and obviously have an impact on how hard you're willing to go, where the bottom line actually is for you.
Let's pass over to Bridie to pick up the discussion from here and present her point of view.
Thank you. Hello. Hello, I'm Bridie. Hello. Yes, I work for Stuff in Parliament. But yeah, that's just because there's no way my personal opinion. And I'm not really going to be offering advice, just a sort of a view of the election, which I just covered. So the 2023 election was a massive wake-up call for Labour, as you're all probably very aware. So why did it all go so wrong? When you sort of go out and talk to people, it's a sort of smorgasbord of social issues which sprang out of the pandemic, really, and the government's response to that. So obviously it was a cost of living issue, high inflation, the perception of a big increase in crime, and obviously there was an increase in youth ram raiding. And then sort of public services worsening as a result of that, broadly, that pivot to sort of focus on the pandemic, which led to delays in the health system and that sort of thing. So that was kind of people's main gripes when you were out and about. It also appeared to be, Labour's handling of divisive issues and policies, such as co-governance and Three Waters, losing control of that narrative, effectively leaving it to the opposition to pick it up, and Te Pāti Māori to make sense of it as well. And as you've both touched on, the handling of a capital gains and a wealth tax and making an argument for that. And probably something Simon can talk a bit better to, the loss of Auckland, losing the Auckland vote as a result probably of pandemic policy and lockdowns. And I would posit as well, just chatting to people, there's been a bit of a misogynistic kickback against Jacinda Ardern. Yes, so Labour will obviously need to get its head around all of these things before it moves forward. On the Greens, just very high level, I think there is a small case to make of them cannibalising votes from their friends in Labour, but I think some in the Greens maybe see this as a bit of a deflection if it's being overstated, because the Greens just really needed Labour to hold the centre, which it failed to do. And for Te Pāti Māori, I mean, they did exactly what they sought to do. They have pitched themselves to young Māori voters and done really well, swooping 6 out of 11 Māori electorate seats so far. They're thinking of themselves as a longer term movement, so that's they're successfully doing that. yeah, I can't, from my perspective, I think the key issues are how Labour moves forward now without Ardern, bigger questions which have touched on about who it stands for, what it is here for, and how it works alongside the Greens and Te Pāti Māori, how much damage it's done to its Māori voter base, and also the bigger question of why Chris Hipkins and Labour, they did so poorly at selling their cost of living policies this election. Yeah, it's my 2 cents.
You wrote a piece about James Shaw commenting on the treaty referendum and how that could blow the country apart. How do you see that referendum stacking up in the coalition discussions that are going on now? And also a bigger question from that, could the coalition itself blow apart in a year or two's time and create the way for the parties of the left to come back?
Yeah, so Luxon will definitely not be wanting a referendum of any kind. He is a keen follower of politics overseas, Australia and the UK specifically, so he would have seen what just happened with The Voice in Australia and know that this would be terrible for the National Party and him if he was to allow this to happen. But I mean, at the same time, you've got David Seymour as we all know, a very convictions-led politician, and they'll probably have to give him some kind of concession in this area. What that looks like, I don't know. And then you've got New Zealand First as well, sort of stirring the culture wars pot around this. But I think it is fair to say that it would, the commentary about how divisive and it would just tear at the fabric of New Zealand. So I think there is not a lot of political appetite within the majority of people in Parliament for this to occur.
Bridie, you just mentioned Britain in relation to what Luxon follows closely, and I hadn't thought about this, but the Brexit referendum had the effect of moved the Overton window. It changed the nature of politics in Britain, and they were there and then they were over there, and they're never coming back, or not in the foreseeable. Do you think that's a factor in Luxon's mind now, and do you think it's a real thing, that if we have a referendum on the treaty, the consequences will be as severe for us?
Yes, and yes. So at the National Party's first caucus sort of retreat, when after Luxon was made leader a couple of years ago, they got George Osborne to zoom in. So he, I'm pretty sure it's been reported that he's got, James Cameron's biography. Oh, David Cameron, sorry, biography. It's been a long couple of weeks on his shelf. So, yeah, I think keen follower. So, yes, he would have followed that all very closely. And, I mean, if you look at, how much you want to read into this, but in Luxon's private life before politics in New Zealand, he had a lot of initiatives around inclusivity and that sort of thing. I don't really think he doesn't want to go here. Yeah.
Just I guess a supplementary question that comes to mind is, from your framing, Philip, it's not clear to me that, obviously, terrible thing to happen if a referendum does go ahead, but it's not clear to me that that would necessarily play in the left's favour either. I think it makes things very unpredictable, because while I think there is broadly a growing consensus on the left, or not a consensus, but there's a commitment to, the treaty in some sense on the left, I'm sure that there are all kinds of hidden divisions that are totally unproductive to the left or anyone that would probably be surfaced as a result of that. So I think, fingers crossed, that doesn't happen.
I wanted to ask you another question from the press gallery perspective. One of the things that I think probably surprised a lot of people during the campaign was Labour's apparent inability to counter the attacks on its failure to deal with crime, retail crime particularly. You mentioned ram raids. Its failure to appear to deal with crisis in the health system, particularly in hospitals, and the more general and widespread sense of anger in the community. These things are global. We know that, but that's just a comment to make, really. It doesn't make them any less worrying or any less severe or upsetting for people here, because they're real here. Why was it that Labour wasn't able to stand up in front of those things and own them and be coherent about them and be compelling about them?
I think it's a really hard sell. Do you say, oh, hey, we have a nursing shortage, there's a global shortage, it's been looming for a really long time here. Yes, we've been in power for 6 years, but it was bad before then. We've done our best, but it's not any better, sorry. That's a hard sell. And the same with RAM rating. I think, there was, I haven't looked into the latest data, but there was not really a spike in crime, but it was just RAM rating had gone up. And again, that's also a really hard thing to flip when people are seeing maybe in their small towns or urban centres that, shops are being broken into. That was something we picked up on the campaign trail because National was often visiting shops that had been recently broken into or put up, protections after it had happened. And people were traumatised, and it had a big effect on the sort of local community, and the sort of anger towards Labour was huge. I mean, there's obviously places National specifically gone to, but it was definitely, it's easy to blame Labour for all these things, and they are complicated.
It strikes me from looking at it in Auckland that it's not necessarily you have to blame Labour, you just have to, for causing them, you have to blame Labour for not being able to respond to them. And in Auckland, it was really clear, this is a city that historically, where there's a large immigrant communities, different immigrant communities, and Labour has tended to politically own all of them, and that has changed in recent times, not very recently, but it's accelerated. The change has accelerated recently, and in particular, it came to a head around what happens to dairies. Labour wasn't able to say, yes, we believe you have the right to be safe in your dairy and go home safe at night. That's a message that everybody understands is true for forestry workers, and there have been campaigns on it, but dairy owners never heard that. And the immigrant communities that stand behind dairy owners never heard it, and there was a real sea change in the Auckland electorate because of those things like that. And as a result, Michael Wood is no longer an MP, because he is in the most multicultural electorate in the country, or was. I think that's probably not the only reason he's no longer an MP, but it was a critical part of it. Auckland has the capacity to be a much more liberal city, and it ought to be, because cities tend to be more liberal than the rest of any country, but it's not right now, and there's a big lesson there.
Nothing. The only thing I'd add would be, I think with, in terms of the issues with Labour's response on the law and order front, I think a similar issue with lots of the areas where they are weak on is that they were preemptively constrained by the constraints they put on themselves, I guess, financially as well, and that they prioritised, they drew the line here in terms of debt, and whilst ruling out revenue-raising measures like tax policies, when there's no magic red line there, it's a political question of priority. And I think it's clear that with the criminal justice system, there's just immense strain at every part of the system. So to put on my lawyer hat for a second, I work mainly in the district court doing legal aid criminal defence work, and the prosecutors and the police, everyone is totally under strain. It's the same as the hospitals. The fundamental issue primarily is, I think, one of resourcing rather than of some technical issue. And so I think if you're saying, well, there's just no money, we can't do anything, then that's not a very appealing message to take to voters, when the right has a very compelling message, which is that there's bad people out there that need to be punished.
Good one. Over to you, Simon. You grab the microphone that's next to you. Yep.
Yes, working? No.
It will do, yeah.
It was working? Yeah. Yes? Okay, thank you. So I wanted to talk first about some of the what I regard as some of the conditions of our politics now. And the first one is that I don't think there is a middle ground. The usual approach in politics in elections is that the major parties are campaigning to win the middle ground from each other. And the supposition is that there's a large mass of voters who don't want to rock the boat. They want to stay there in the middle and not go to one side or the other. I think that's wrong. I think voters in this election, and I think we've seen it previously, and I think it'll stay this way, voters want the boat rocked. Voters were upset and angry, and they wanted to vote for someone. They were fed up and wanted change, and they wanted to vote for parties that they thought would deliver change. And Christopher Luxon understood that and was able to say, voters, he actually literally said that. Chris Hitchens should have been able to say it too. We have come out of COVID, it is time for change, we're the people who can deliver it, but he wasn't able to say that. And I don't think it was really perceived in Labour that middle ground of people who are looking for a quiet life, I don't think they perceive that that's the wrong thing, that's gone. The second point is that the wealthy in this country have discovered that they can buy an election, and that's not going to go away. Nobody's going to reform the electoral system to the extent that we are able to stop that. And you know, the amount of money that a pretty small number of extremely wealthy people put into National and ACT and New Zealand First was extraordinary compared to what Labour and the Greens got, and massively extraordinary compared to what Te Pāti Māori got. You can speculate about what they thought they were buying, and it's easy to see that there will now be a massive redistribution of wealth in favour of landlords in this country. It's easy to see that they had hoped to buy easier rules for property development, less impediments to bringing in foreign money and all of that. But the wealthy will continue to buy elections, and that is something that people have to, I think on the left, there needs to be a public campaign always about it. That needs to be demonised. We need to make that a scandalous thing that happens in this country. The third condition of our politics now is that the far right are going to keep up their vicious attacks, especially on women and on Māori. And they will search for and find flashpoints. There is lots of examples of this. I mean, this comes out of America, a lot of it, and it's pretty clear, I think, that on the far right in New Zealand, people have learned the lessons of America and are trying to apply them and have been successful. And the flashpoints are often trivial. Bike lanes, which don't cost much and don't affect people, but become enormous causes. Three Waters which would not have the way in which Three Waters proposed to reorganise the nature of water funding and administration in this country would have made no material difference except to the good for almost everybody. But it was demonised. Transgender rights is another example. The issue itself isn't the important thing. What happens when these things are blown up is that that hatred and fear and anger is stoked. The left gets disorganised because the left starts arguing among itself about whether it's important or not, and is it a distraction or not, and it makes progressive policies more dangerous to promote, so people get scared of doing it. And it is a very successful tactic being used on the right, and it will continue to be used, and again, we've got to be aware of that and ready for it. I don't know what the next issue will be. It's very hard to see them before they arrive, but I would guess that the 15-minute city, if those of you who know what that means, 15-minute city will become a flashpoint issue in this country sometime perhaps over the next year. It's going to be proposed as something that all it means is that actually we should try to develop our society so that people don't need to drive so much, and it's going to be proposed as something that is will force people to stay in their homes and not move around, and it's an absurd thing. But that'll be one. The fourth condition of our politics now is that leaders who are women will be attacked with hatred and fury, and that will continue. And Bridie will tell you, I'm sure, that it happens to journalists. I know it happens to all my colleagues who are women. I mean, I get hate mail, but it's nothing. It's just nothing compared to what I know my women colleagues get, particularly if they write anything about sexual violence or domestic abuse or anything like that, or actually stick their heads up in politics. Leaders who are women will be attacked with hatred and fury, but it doesn't mean that male and pale and stale political leaders will be popular. Luxon won the election, but he didn't win it himself. His party won, but it didn't make him more popular. And of course, Hipkins found that to his cost as well. The next condition is that it's worth, I think, remembering that there's an old trope on the left that National and Labour are much the same, or an old trope among many people. It isn't true. National, with its partners, is going to be a right-wing government determined to get things done. Luxon has told us over and over. They're going to roll back workers' rights, they're going to eviscerate climate action, they're going to marginalise beneficiaries, they're going to demonise Māori, and they will continue to stoke division in society and neglect to invest in infrastructure, the infrastructure we need to prosper. And those things will accelerate the other new phenomenon that we have in society now, which is that we are too often and too easily at each other's throats. It's odd that in terms of the class elements of that, the main handbrake on this government is going to be not Labour or the Greens or Te Pāti Māori, who will be vocal, but the main handbrake will be New Zealand First, who are not interested in rolling back workers' rights particularly, and are going to make it more difficult for National and ACT to behave the way they want to. And yet, New Zealand First contains Casey Costello, who goes to Parliament courtesy of Hobson's pledge, and she will be, I imagine, in Cabinet before the end of this parliamentary term. And ACT contains Andrew Hoggard, climate denialist out of Federated Farmers. He will be in Cabinet before the end of this parliamentary term. This is a real change that we're seeing in government in this country now. So many MPs now on the right are climate deniers, social reactionaries, and COVID conspiracists. It's a very different setup from what we've had. So it's important. It's important that we lost this election, and it's important that we fight that the left fights to try and regain. And I think it's worth remembering that because things are volatile now, I don't think the old idea that governments are in for 3 terms unless they really fuck it up, I don't think that holds. I think people are looking for things to go right for them in politics, and if they're not happy after 3 years, they'll rethink. My first election, it was 1975. It was terribly exciting. We thought we were going to re-elect the second term of the Norman Kirk Bill Rolling government. I remember the party that night in our flat, and there were 2 girls out in the kitchen drinking a bottle of champagne because they'd voted National. And it was Rob Muldoon's election, right? He won that. 1978 and 1981, he won again and again, but it was FPP and he didn't win the popular vote. Most New Zealanders voted Labour rather than National in those 2 elections. It only took 1 term of Rob Muldoon for that to change. And those things can happen again. We are in a volatile time, and it's absolutely imperative that people get ready for the next one to rebuild and go. The last condition of our politics now, I think, that I just wanted to mention was that there's a real question about whether the big issues have become too hard to address. It's easy to say, why do they focus on the trivial little things when there are big issues? But actually, the question of why Labour did so little in the last 6 years, part of the answer to that is, actually, is it possible? You can look at things like light rail in Auckland and in this city, farm emissions, high wage economy, domestic violence, treaty partnerships, the evolution of those, a range of equity issues. Has it become too hard to get big things done? The answer has to be no, because they need to be done, but it's far from clear how they can be done. So there are a whole lot of really big questions, I think, in front of everybody now in relation to that. And I guess the thing to take heart from is that I was told after the 2005 election by someone who was in the room that Helen Clark announced to her caucus that there should be no new social policy this term because that was going to be too controversial and they would have to fight the wrong fights. So everybody had to just quietened down on social policy for the third term of the Helen Clark government. And then Sue Bradford's bill on smacking got drawn out of the ballot box. And the magnificent thing was that Labour fought for that, and so did National. And if you remember, there was a referendum on it, which was, I think, close to 90% opposed. It was extraordinary. Parliament, MPs had the moral fortitude to do the right thing. Yeah, and that was not so very long ago. That can be done, and it can be done again. And so the idea that we should run away from controversy is wrong, in my view. What we have to do is fight the fight with the good arguments and with the commitment. I just briefly wanted to look at a couple of other things. I think the great task now is to restore the credibility of progressive reform. It's a terrible legacy of the outgoing Labour government, is that task has become so much harder because progressive reform doesn't look credible, because so little of it was done, and it looks as if it was too hard, and therefore perhaps it was wrong to try. I think one of the other things that we can learn is that there is very often on the left an argument about should we be focusing more on class, or should we be focusing more on climate or identity issues or whatever. Those disputes, okay, let's have them, but those disputes are fundamentally nonsense. And if you ask me, there is a working class party in this, a party in this country that attends to working class needs with wages and benefits, living conditions and social aspirations, in fundamental issues of health and housing, and it's the Green Party. The Green Party has a coherent economic policy that would service very well the working class and is also a climate party. It's clearly possible to have both those focuses and to make them function. Auckland, as I've mentioned before, has swung to the right, though not only to the right, it also swung to the Greens and it also swung to ACT. Actually, Auckland, like the rest of the country, but especially in Auckland, was an ABL party, anyone but Labour, an ABL city, anyone but Labour. And that is actually what happened in the election. People were fed up with Labour and went elsewhere in every direction. I think there are some lessons from the Greens situation now that Labour should not find it too hard to take. And one of them is that you have to stand for something. Another one is that tax reform is essential and benefits reform along with it. The third one is that you can and must integrate class and climate goals. And a fourth one is that the right will respond with hysterics. Just live with it. And I just wanted to finish my comments here talking about Clement Attlee. We'll all remember Clement Attlee, who won the 1945 general election in Britain. He was the Deputy Prime Minister under Winston Churchill through the war. And while Churchill was winning the war, with Attlee's support, Attlee produced a coherent plan for a welfare state. Well, it wasn't just Attlee, there were a whole lot of people who did it, but he was the political figure who led the process. So that from 1942 onwards, British people had the information given to them over and over and over. There was a manifesto which was sold and very wide, over 1 million copies sold. It was widely distributed. They built the social, what we now call the social license for a welfare state, so that when the election came along at the end of the war in 1945, the message was, we fought this war for a purpose, we deserve this. This, the welfare state, is what we were fighting for. And that was extraordinarily powerful. Clement Attlee didn't just sneak in, Labour didn't just sneak in, it was a crushing victory in 45, and they won again after. We can learn from that. Everybody on the left can learn from that. The political parties on the left can learn from that. Great leadership. Get the message out, get the message right, believe in it, keep moving forward, and take the fight to them. And I think that's a lesson that Labour perhaps has lost in its desire to not take the fight to anyone, but to keep things happy, and yet that's not what politics is. So take the fight to them. And I guess one last point for the Greens. I would like to think that the Greens have a strategy right now, which is that they want to build up the quality of their caucus, because in 2026 perhaps, and 2029 certainly, the Greens should be dominant in cabinet, and they need to have enough really good MPs with experience to be in that position. So that's the absolute alternative, difference from what Ollie suggested. I think lots of the best people need to be there for that reason.
So you're saying that the Greens will take over from Labour as the major party of the left?
I don't even know that that's true, and I don't think that matters whether that's true. What I do think, though, is that when it comes to the next centre-left government, the Greens have to be in a position to go, we've got all these people who would make great cabinet ministers, and that's got to be largely recognised as being true.
Coming back, hold on to your microphone. Coming back to the centre, you're saying the centre wanted change. Picking up Danyl McLauchlan's article, Danyl was arguing that the centre are strategic conservatives, and it's the centre who are voting for New Zealand First to act as a handbrake.
I don't,
on both sides.
Yeah, I don't think that's true. I don't think it's right to see New Zealand First as a centrist party. They have this odd thing of being pro small business and working class, and also being socially reactionary, and therefore that makes them look as if they're partly right and partly left, and therefore they're centrist. I think they're a right-wing party with some old-fashioned Muldoonist, interventionist theories of economics that underpin them, and that's the best part of them. But they're also profoundly unreliable and malicious in their approach to politics and democracy. And don't use the word malicious lightly. I really think they are. Even if all their policies were great, the way in which they conduct politics is a blight on our democracy, in my view. But getting back to the core of your question, the centre leans, or its instinct is to go right. I think the centre's, if the floating voters, the Jacinda Ardern Labourites and the John Key the Jacinda Ardern nationalists and the John Key Labour voters, so that group of people, they want someone who they believe will get things done. I think they want someone who they like and trust will represent them and represent them well, and when that trust runs out, they vote somewhere else. But I don't think that's the same as saying they jump to the right.
It was more, I think Danyl's argument was more going for a handbrake on both on right and left.
Well, that's Winston Peters' pitch, isn't it? Yeah.
You covered a lot of ground there. I thought I'd just, for sharing information, pick up on a couple of things. So something you mentioned was about the abuse and threats that parliamentarians are facing, and I guess public figures now as well, as we've seen with Susie Wiles and people who spoke during the pandemic, and that is definitely worsening I think people would be horrified at the scale. There was a survey done, I think about a year ago, and it was something like 80% of all women parliamentarians had pretty serious and incredible threats made to them, and I think the latest one is basically all of them now, and most of the men. So, it's a pretty septic and feral political environment in which people are working in now, and that has, we saw that obviously with the protests at Parliament and some of the rhetoric there. But you'd think it's really important to keep in perspective of these huge sort of background issues that are bubbling away in New Zealand, and imported perspectives that are really troubling and bad for everyone across the political spectrum. And certainly on the sort of, obviously we had our March 15 terror attack, and Ardern obviously set up the Christchurch call as a result of that. That sort of lost all political will now. I think Google and Meta didn't attend the last meeting, so sort of speculation as to how bad that was, considering their huge giants of the sort of online world. So, yeah, we've got these huge issues, and we don't really have the infrastructure, the political will, the right people to sort of lead us through them, it would appear. Or no one's sort of really keen to pick that up. We didn't hear any of it over the campaign, and certainly people on the political right are not really keen to speak out if they've faced abuse or things like that, because they don't want to be perceived as weak. So yeah, I have no idea what the way forward is, but it is a huge problem in our public life.
I think there's another reason that people are reluctant to speak out about it, and I assume it's one of the things that Jacinda Ardern didn't tell us, was that nobody wants to discourage good people from going into politics, you know? So you don't want to say, this is what you'll get, because it's horrible.
Yeah. And then at the same time, I think there was in Northland, I went up to Northland to do a profile of the region, so not necessarily with politicians, not on the campaign trail, just cruising around, and there was an event where Willow Jean Prime was speaking at, and she was very badly heckled. Every time she said a Māori word, the room erupted, and yeah, exactly all of that. And I mean, speaking afterwards, it was Grant McCallum from National and Shane Jones as well was sort of saying they wish they'd intervened and they'd wish they'd said something at the time, but they didn't, and let it occur. So I think, yeah, I don't know. It benefits some people and doesn't others, and people were going to use it for their own benefit.
That kitty meeting was, I think there's a real lesson in that, because Grant McCallum is a decent bloke, you know. He's not one of those people who froth at the mouth. He's now the National MP for Northland, but he's a nice guy. I've met him a few times, but didn't say anything. Shane Jones, who knows perfectly well what was going on, didn't say anything. People have to say things. Yeah. And
it happened at quite a few meetings, I was told as well. It wasn't just that one. I think there was a particularly bad one, but it had occurred at, I think, most meetings that they all went to, or the hustings they had. And I think they both said at other meetings they finally spoke up, or that sort of thing. But the fact that it happened persistently, and it is this, you know, sort of public humiliation intended to diminish Willow Jean, and is, yeah, I don't know what the solution is, but I think it does deter people, and as well as the in-person stuff, you've got the online environment, which is really septic for people as well. I think it just sort of hangs over people's heads when they're coming into work every day, and people are keen to talk about it sort of person to person, but they often don't want to talk about it publicly because it's almost, again, like that humiliation element, and yeah, it's a huge price to bear. And just in my own inbox, I mean, the amount, I don't get that much abuse sometimes, but not too bad. But I have colleagues that have covered crime, for example. I had a female colleague, she left journalism. The sort of protest was a sort of cherry on top of the abuse she would get while covering crime. And certainly abuse about Ardern, the stuff that I would get abusing Ardern was just revolting. And now Hipkins is in charge. It doesn't appear in my inbox. There's no one being mean about his appearance. Yeah, just revolting insults, and mostly oriented on what she looks like. And Kitty Allen as well, when she had her fall from grace, any time you wrote about that, it was a slew of revolting and racist and sexist emails from people. So it is pretty shocking, the type of people that are out living amongst us and the views they hold. Concerning.
And that they feel it's okay to express them now.
Yeah.
That's a different thing. That's new.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, but I mean, it was a bit cathartic again when I went on my little roadshow, because I profiled Northland and the East Coast and got a renewed faith in New Zealand's humanity after just talking to normal people for a couple of weeks. So there is hope, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
One point that I thought was interesting that you made, Simon, about observing this new trend of, it's not super new now, but of the last few years with the right finding these divisive issues to mobilise around. And I think there's a question of how does the left respond to that? And I'd be interested to hear both Bridie and your thoughts on that, because it seems to me that there's a difference of opinion amongst people on the left. Do you give these things, do you adopt a robust, strong, open, responsive conflict, essentially, to counter protest or to engage in the substantive debate about the thing, whether that's to do with trans rights or the treaty or whatever it is, or do you not give it oxygen and focus on other issues instead, or is that a false dichotomy? But I think there is how does the left respond to that in a way that doesn't feed into that narrative framing of the issues?
I think it's extraordinary. Chair's going to fall over. I think it's extraordinarily difficult, and the transgender issue is possibly the most difficult. The transgender debate on the left pits some long-time feminists who have fought for women's rights and continue to do so, and are appalled at the idea that private women's spaces should be open to anybody who was not biologically born a woman. Pits that against probably the most marginalised and vulnerable and at-risk group in our society, which is transgender people and young transgender people in particular. And there is no right answer in my own view. It's a really difficult, fraught debate. But it is foisted on us as a furious debate that we all have to get terribly upset about by the right. It is not in any real material sense an issue that we do need to get that upset about, because mostly it's managed much more in real life. It doesn't produce the conflict that the right says it does. But the right has inflamed it, and we suffer the consequences of that. It's really, there are issues in society that it's not a new thing in a way. It used to be argued that a woman's place is in the home, and that was an outrageous idea, always, but it was powerful in its time. No one would say it now. We get over those things. It used to be argued that politics and sport don't mix. Stupid thing to say. But you'll all remember how powerful that was. That was the main rallying cry on the right over the Springbok tour. That was the thing that united, the slogan that united supporters of the tour. We get over these things, we get past them, and then a new one comes along. And so I guess it behoves all of us not to let this become something that we get so angry and upset about that it destroys everything, because the fierceness of the dispute will pass. But it's very hard to see that when you're in the middle of it.
Well, I took down various notes from the rich tapestry of your talk, Simon. Perhaps just to touch on a few of those briefly, I think a theme that both in your address now and also Danyel's piece, when he's talking, I think the alt-centrist manifesto piece, picking up the issue of the influence of money in politics, and that's clearly, I think, a major issue. But I guess my observation would be that, legal reform would be great and is obviously needed, but that in itself is obviously not enough, which is not what you were saying. I see the issue of vested interests and the influence of money in politics primarily as being a reflection of the underlying inequality of wealth and power, and better, more robust legal rules will help us probably see the problem more clearly and help prevent the more overt cases of that. But ultimately it does come down to the politics ultimately, and I think you're right that making it an unpalatable thing is crucial.
You'll also know that from a lay perspective, we've had a series of examples of financial corruption in politics, in political funding, none of which have been upheld by the courts. Courts have thrown them all out. It's extraordinary. Courts will not get involved. The law appears to be relatively clear, but it isn't. And the idea that we might ever have strong enough legal restraints on people trying to buy elections is just not, I can't see that ever happening. So we have to politically campaign on it. We have to say, that's wrong, that's bad, that's anti-democratic, and keep saying it.
I think it also dovetails to another theme that both you and Danyl have raised, which is this question of delivery. Can we do these things? And I think it's not just buying elections, but the influence of business on the policy development process. And there's been a lot of reporting recently from RNZ about this. I think the supermarket lobbyists and the Commerce Commission, I think, was the story the other day. And the question I have is how does that fit into this bigger picture of how we've got to this point where we've got a public sector filled with many talented, passionate people that is pretty well resourced in some ways, but there are these big issues in terms of the implementation of these important reform programs. And so I don't know what the answer to that is, but I think it's an area where it would benefit the left to think more about, to understand when the left's next in power, how can we be sure that we can actually implement the policies that we're elected on to deliver?
I think there's something else about politics that is easy to forget when we're talking about election cycles and all that. And politicians always tell you that politics is what they do, and when we vote for them, it's what we do when we vote. Politics, as I'm sure you all know, is much wider than that. And the exciting politics in this country tends to be nowhere near Parliament. And that's something that, in my view, progressive forces have to kind of double down on. We need stronger communities. We need stronger activist groups. We need some mass movements. We also need some fringe activists who are going to be carrying out disruptive behaviours. We need community support, community work. We need, as you know, in Auckland this year, the disastrous effects of Cyclone Gabrielle and the anniversary weekend storms are still being felt there, and all of that wild weather threw onto local communities real questions about their ability to organise for themselves. And in many parts of the city, and I believe it's true in Hawke's Bay, but I know about it in Auckland because I've been to the meetings, in many parts of the city, local communities have really risen up, have really learnt how to organise for themselves, have learnt how to act well for themselves, to lobby into central and local government to get things done. There is enormous strength there. And those things are going to become, as the climate worsens, as we get more of those storms, more of that wild weather, they're just going to keep getting more important. And as the right-wing attacks on communities continue, they're also going to be more important for all those reasons. And out of that, political parties, if political parties can draw from those things and be inspired by those things and learn from them and be part of them, we'll get a stronger progressive movement in this country. And what happens in Parliament is really important, because you need legislation. You can't just do it from people changing their own behaviour. You need legislation. So what happens in Parliament is critical. But it's part of a bigger ecosystem. And because the left has lost an election doesn't mean that people should despair, I guess.
Bridie, do you want to pick up on the role of the press gallery? How far does the press gallery just focus on the workings of government, and how far do you broaden out from there? Like your tour of you were talking about a tour of the East Coast and Northland. Grab that microphone.
So the press gallery does tend to be pretty insular, so most reporters in there will just be covering the day-to-day there. I'm more interested in like talking to normal people generally as well, so trying to infuse that into my life for my sanity. You can get very caught up in this sort of House of Cards wannabe sort of style, and not really, I think, because a lot of reporters maybe don't necessarily come from a rounds background where they haven't covered like education or health or something else, infrastructure, so they're not necessarily coming at it with a view of the communities they want to serve. I don't know, you can get swept up in the ego in there, as you can imagine. But yeah, I think there is certainly, obviously others are doing a fantastic job, and there's not to brag, but my stories about the Northland and electorate were some of the most read on stuff regarding the election. So it doesn't, it's sort of, it doesn't have to be, Chris Bishop says this or whatever. People actually are really interested to hear how their fellow New Zealanders are faring and what's happening and how these policies affect people's day-to-day lives and their own lives and what that means for the future of the country. So I think there's a huge remit to do better reporting in that space and go out to areas that are not being served well and hear their take on things and what's gone wrong for them.
Any other points you've got? You've been making some notes.
Oh yes, sort of just like mad scribbles. It's interesting just wanted to pick up a little bit, just a small aside on the lobbying stuff. It is quite interesting seeing how Parliament works. But I remember when I was pretty new to being a political reporter when Aisha Verrill announced her smoke-free 2025 legislation, and I was like, oh, but what about the tobacco lobby? And asked her, like, have they been harassing you? And she was like, yeah, but I'm not going to meet with them, So I think, you can kind of overstate the scope of lobbying. If someone's not interested, that's that. And yeah, so I guess it just depends how much their interests are sort of all tied together. So as an outsider coming in, that was something that struck me. What else have I been scribbling? I think there's more of a discussion to be had just watching the election campaign. Hipkins sort of failing to sell those cost of living policies and like a vision for New Zealand that really didn't come across. And I think that was obviously to the Labour Party's detriment hugely. Really low energy at the start of the campaign, and there was a lot of commentary that he was acting more like an opposition leader. I think a lot of it was just down to lack of salesmanship, really. That's another thing I was scribbling. And just in terms of where, Louise Upston, I don't know if you all saw on the campaign trail as well, said something about people on benefits turning up to job interviews in their pyjamas as part of the sanctioning thing. And we were sort of, the reporters there were just like, what? And, pushed her on this and said, why, where have you got this from? Why are you saying this? And she was, I've been, told this by people that work in MSD and that sort of thing. So, it's, we can challenge them as a reporting pack, but, the comments that they may have do play to the crowd, and people like that. They like these ideas of lazy people on benefits, and they like this idea of,
It doesn't matter what the answer is.
No.
You said it now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And especially in a cost of living crisis, if people feel like they're under pressure and they think, why do people on benefits get anything? That's not what about me. And
One last, Simon, you've got... Yeah.
I was just going to say, I mentioned before about the Greens and the policies. The Greens have a guaranteed minimum income policy, which hardly got talked about in the election because it was all wealth tax, which is part of the larger policy. But in my view, wealth tax or some kind of asset tax is going to become inevitable in this country, because it's inevitable most places. Some kind of universal benefit will become inevitable, and the guaranteed minimum income of the Greens is one option. There's a universal, there are different ways to do it, but we're going to be living in my view, within 20 years in a very different world economically, because of the ravages of climate, and because it's really pretty obvious that capitalism ain't going away, but it ain't getting better. So learning how to live with it and modify it, of course, becomes really important. So there are fundamental policies that will become, that all progressive forces need to be trying to move into the mainstream as quickly as possible, because they're going to become inevitable, and they're going to become so necessary, I think. And there's another element to this which we haven't really talked about at all, and it's called Te Pāti Māori. As Ollie mentioned, they have, I think, or was it Ollie? I think they have a longer term strategy. I asked John Tamahiri in this campaign why they weren't telling everybody all the time that everybody can vote for them. You don't have to be in a Māori electorate. And that is news to most people when you tell them that. And he wasn't worried, because his view is they've got a long-term strategy. They stood 1 or 2 people in general electorates this election, but in 2-3 elections' time, they intend to be a really big party in the mainstream. And, well, yes, yay, yes, it has challenges for the Greens and it has challenges for Labour, and that will work itself out. I don't think it's the challenge that should be objected to. I think it's just the way in which we're going to evolve. But they do have that big, strong goal, and they have it on the basis of, we are a party that is a radical party because we are fed up. We represent people who deserve so much better. We all know this, and we're not going to resign from that. And it is terribly stirring and inspiring to listen to their good people talking about those things. And the happiest political events I went to during the campaign were Te Pāti Māori events. The people who were on the edge, but actually so inspired by what they were trying to do. I think that's a call to us, isn't it?
I think that's a great place to finish with alarm in the distance. Thank you very much indeed.